Hello and welcome to BelPod, the podcast dedicated to Belarusian football. In this episode, we'll start with some sad news about last season's Prashaya Liga champions, before singling out some of the more salient moments for us of the last 3 weeks, both on and off the field of play. In part 2, we'll hear from Dmitriy Kandarenka about all things Krumkachy, and in our third and final section, we'll focus on some of the moves which have already been made since the transfer window opened last week, as well as looking ahead to the standout fixtures for us of round 16 as the second half of the campaign begins. Hello again to you all, and I suppose there's only really one place to start tonight, John, with some very sad news coming out of Belarus for all Sputnik fans.
Yes, Sputnik Rechitsa are no more, and they've been withdrawn from the Major League calendar. I think this has been in the post for quite a while, Liam, but we did enjoy watching Sputnik for the first half of the season, and it's a real shame, not just for the fans in Rechitsa, but also for the league, that Sputnik are now not going to feature, and all their future games will be awarded 3-0 to the opponent, just as happened with Torpedo Minsk in 2019. I mean, what's your views on this?
Yeah, it's inevitable, but still desperately sad. I mean, the interview that I read today with one of their now former players on Tribune, it really upset me, to be honest, at the thought of these players. And I think really amazing testament, of course, since we last recorded. We did have what I would argue, John, is perhaps one of the results of the entire season in the whole of Europe when Sputnik came back from 3-0 down against Vitebsk with about 25 minutes to go to win 4-3. And when you think, with hindsight, we now know that none of those players were being paid. They hadn't been paid for months, and yet they still found, the character and the belief to win that game. And I suppose it's almost like a fitting epitaph. I know they did play after that against Slutsk, but for me, that was their last game. It was played in Rechitsa, the last home game in Rechitsa, which they only played a couple of times, didn't they, overall? And that for me was a fitting epitaph, but still incredibly sad. No one likes to see a football club go. There were plenty of people there that day. Who are they going to support now? So yeah, it leaves a horrible feeling of regret for all those people who've lost their team.
That's right, but there will be a Rechitsa football team next year, I'm sure. I mean, the Telegram channel Silver Age was already speculating today that there would be a Rechitsa 2022 amateur level next year, and they would start building up. Because, of course, don't forget that the current Sputnik team were only around since 2017. And when Rechitsa, their major backers, pulled the plug at the end of the season, and the local Rayon politicians showed that they weren't interested and weren't going to support the team in the top league, and the writing was on the wall. And you did hope that Chairman Monastirski was going to be able to find some money from somewhere, but clearly it's not been forthcoming. They've been let down by sponsors. The money we thought that they'd get from Belarusneft didn't materialise, and therefore this outcome is inevitable.
Yeah, very sad. A very sad development. Of course, we lost Gorodea last year, who we quite liked, gently ribbing, but it's never nice to see a football team go bust. And I suppose, although we've seen it happen in our country in recent years, it's still something that makes us it takes us aback a bit, doesn't it? Because it's not necessarily par for the course in either England or Scotland, I think we'd suggest, would we?
I mean, if you think back in the last 30 years, Liam, I can think of about half a dozen teams across the whole UK and all the different leagues that have gone out of business or ceased to exist. But in Belarus, it seems to be at least one, sometimes two a season. And even in seasons where teams don't disappear, there's always one or two in chronic financial problems and at death's door. But as we've said in many previous episodes, of course, football and football clubs reflect the wider situation in the country, and Belarus sadly is in a dire economic situation at the moment. And when the clubs are dependent on the state for their finances, then of course there's going to be a knock-on effect in difficult economic times.
Talking of difficult economic times, I don't suppose Shakhtyor will be particularly upset by the loss of revenue by not getting through to the next round of the Champions League. Clearly, it wouldn't be something they would have banked on. I did feel quite sorry for them in a way. They got a dreadful draw, didn't they, John, in Ludogorets? Probably the worst draw they could possibly have had. Over the two legs, I just felt they weren't quite good enough. And that was a great shame because, I think there was big expectations on them. And I know that there's always a sense, Belarusian teams can never achieve anything in Europe after Barte's glory years a few years ago. But, given what they were up against, John, I felt they gave a pretty decent account of themselves. And certainly last night in the second leg, I had two feelings overall. One was if this had been played in Soligorsk, it might have been a very different story. I thought the team came out played a lot better than they had done in the first leg, a lot more confidence. They looked like they felt they could win the game. And also a wonderful chance created for himself, to be fair, by Demba Darba with some fantastic pace. Good save by the keeper. And that was really the only decent chance they had in the whole game. So that was a great shame overall, I think, for Belarusian football. Obviously, it doesn't help their coefficient, does it? But I think we need to be realistic. They went into that game as massive underdogs, even if in Belarusian terms, they are clearly, a big team.
Yes, they were indeed. And I don't think they were disgraced in these two games. Ludogorets, as you said, were the hardest opponents that they could have drawn from their potential list of 5 or 6 opponents, I think it was, that was circulating before the draw. And oddly, I think they can take a lot more credit from this result than their exit and penalties to Moldovan Didi team Svintul Georgia last year, which really smarted. So I think it's a fair enough result. Like you, I'm sorry for Shakhtyor that they didn't have the opportunity to play in Soligorsk, which I think the Bulgarians might not have enjoyed too much. But the good news, Liam, is that they now face Fola Esche from Luxembourg, who were vaporised 5-0 by the mighty Lincoln Red Imps in Gibraltar last night. So if Shakhtyor can't beat those, then there really is something wrong with them. So I'd expect them to at least make some progress in the next European competition, wouldn't you?
I think so, definitely. And of course, they've also had the bonus since we last recorded of seeing Bate being held at Vitebsk, their 7th 0-0 of the season. And that's obviously given them a little bit more. Vitebsk nil is back, John, after a few weeks of excitement. But yeah, certainly, I think they'll be pleased overall, be disappointed, and they'll certainly expect to progress from that tie against Fola Esche. What else, since we last recorded, John, what else has struck you in terms of what's been happening closer to home? Well, not closer to our home, but closer to home in terms of the Vyshchaya Liga?
Well, I've been really impressed by interim coach Chelyadinsky at Dinamo Minsk, and the Bata result aside, which was a hard one for any Dinamo Minsk fan to take. I think they've been quietly impressive, and he's already ringing the changes with Shitov being banished to the doubles and supposedly leaving the club in July, and he was an automatic pick under Leonid Kuchuk. So Chelyadinsky's already come in and putting his own stamp on it. And you can see that although these financial issues are still rumbling away in the background, you can see possibly that he said to the players, look, it might not be great financially, but if you want a decent move away from this club, you're going to have to show it on the park, and that's paying dividends. I mean, that victory over an admittedly diabolical Slavia Mosar team, I think 2 weekends ago, with the Mbeng hat-trick, was a really impressive victory, I felt, and the sort of game that a Kuchuk team would have won in a really turgid 1-0 type manner. But the players seem to be enjoying themselves under Chelyadinsky again, and this for me is really interesting.
Yes, it is really a real change of I suppose maybe because if they're still not getting paid all that they should be getting paid, then I suppose at least you want to work for somebody who isn't a miserable git, basically. I mean, Kuchuk can't be a bundle of fun, can he, in training? And this guy seems to be a little bit more upbeat. And like you say, he probably said to them, if you want to get away from here, then the best thing to do is to start showing it again on the pitch, and then maybe that will get you a move. Anything else that struck you, or can I start banging on about the Brest derby?
You can start banging on about the Brest derby. On you go, Liam.
Right, time to bang on about the Brest derby. My goodness me, what an occasion that was. I absolutely love that game. I think Rook turned up and really went for it as well. They can be very turgid, as we've said before. They can be very difficult to read in terms of what actually they're trying to achieve from the game. I thought they really set about Dinamo, and clearly with a better side, but Dinamo support that night. I mean, we've always said their support is great, but it absolutely went to a different level that night. Fantastic occasion, and just one of those games. Just think, I really, really wish I'd been there for that. And okay, it's not, there weren't 50,000 there. I think there were about 6,500, 7,000, but it sounded like 50,000. Just a fantastic occasion, and fair play to Dinamo, who I think were not outplayed, but it certainly was second best, and they hung on and got the point, and a lot of people went home very happy, didn't they?
Well, it's sort of the Belarusian equivalent of Wimbledon against MK Dons, that, isn't it, really? The old historical club that was at death's door in the winter and has claimed the moral high ground in Brest football versus the brash newcomers with lots of money and lots of players. Okay, there the MK Dons comparison breaks down. But it's interesting to hear that. And I did really enjoy the highlights. And I think in the ABFF website, the highlights are 9 or 10 minutes, which is always the sign of a really good game. I think even the ABFF struggled to get 4 minutes out of some of Gorodea's games last season. So it's great to see that Dinamo are still perhaps punching a bit above their weight. Although there are problems there too, of course, in that I think one of their two players are away, because variously the official version is from Coach Kowalczuk that Dinamo can't pay them the money that was agreed. Unofficially on Telegram and in various portals, it's been circulating that the players who left refused to be involved with signing a pro-government letter and therefore left rather than find themselves in that position. So there is still instability behind the scenes there. But Kowalczuk, I think, is still working really hard to keep this important unity between players and fans together.
Talking of unity between players and fans, one of the biggest highlights for me actually had nothing to do with what went on the pitch the last few weeks, John. An absolutely fantastic opportunity granted to us by Isloch and to the people who work for Isloch in promoting the club, and just I'm sure they do lots of other things apart from that to help the club be what it is. And so a massive thank you to both Alexander and Ilya, who set up this week actually a Zoom call with the coach, Artem Radkov. What a fantastic initiative. We've always felt that Isloch are way ahead of most teams, or I think they're way ahead of all teams in the Vyššená Liga in terms of their fan engagement. They've always been incredibly good to the international fans and really sought to encourage them to carry on supporting the team and give them hope that they actually are interested in us supporting their team if that is your persuasion. And I can't quite believe that the coach gave up an hour of his time to sit and answer questions about the team and about Komorowski's availability and his philosophy as a coach. It was absolutely fantastic, and we're not quite sure exactly how to spread that to a wider audience, but you can guarantee that with Ilya and Alexander's permission we will do so, because it really was a wonderful insight into what it might be to be a coach in the Vyššená Liga, and also wonderful insight into his philosophy about football. And I think that's of interest to all football fans who follow this league, and not just Isloch fans. I think you'd agree about that.
Absolutely, and Artem Radkov's a really impressive coach. I know Isloch have had some tough results recently and they've tumbled down the table, and one or two of the fans on Telegram, Silver Age particularly, don't rate their chances, think they might even end up in a playoff place. But for me, I think that's far too severe an assessment. And I always, even last summer when Radkov was firstly a prominent coach at Energetic and later, of course, briefly at Bata, and he was in the running for the Bata job. He was a serious contender. Clearly, this is a coach with an enormous future in the game in Belarus. So tell me, how was that, Liam? How was it talking to Artem Radkov, and how did he strike you?
Well, I just felt, John, in an age where we get an awful lot of sound bites and an awful lot of people really saying a lot and not really saying anything when they say a lot, just really towing the party line, so to speak. Yeah. Listen, he didn't, obviously he's not able to comment on everything, and he's he's a coach.
Of
He's
course.
not able to tell us everything he can, and some things we don't need to know, and neither do we want to know. But I just felt he was incredibly honest, incredibly open, and he spoke about the importance. He wasn't bothered how many people he was reaching out to. As far as he was concerned, one person, 10 people, as long as they were interested in the club. And he did really back up a lot of what you said all along, John, about the philosophy of the club to bring groups of players together, to bring through young players. And he was quite honest. He said, ultimately our aim, and it was obviously similar to what Energetic have done, perhaps the difference being that Energetic haven't tended to sell on their players, find some players, make them good, and then sell them on. And that will pay to develop the club. That will pay for the training facilities to be developed. And that's the model, and keep bringing players through. And clearly also works incredibly hard. Does ridiculous hours to try and achieve that ambition. So yeah, it was incredibly revealing, and I can't thank him enough for giving his time and for being so open and clear about his philosophy on football, his ideas for Isloch, and just generally how he saw things panning out. And he did say, and I felt this all along, that having a cup final in the middle of the season is really difficult, isn't it? Because you've got a situation where, like for us in England, if players still value playing the cup final, then they go off on holiday, and then they come back in a couple of months and off they go again. But these young players who've got to a cup final halfway through the season, it's going to be difficult to raise them after that, isn't it? It's going to be difficult for them not to feel this is the pinnacle of my season. And then you turn around and realise you've still got to play another 22 league games or something. Yeah. So, and he did sort of say, it has been difficult, not to motivate them, but they're just, some of the younger players have not been there before. They've not had the experience of such a big occasion. And they need to understand that, the humdrum league games need to be won as well.
Yeah, and you just feel with that group of players that he's assembled there, and with the experience he's got developing younger players at Energetic, you feel that the Lisakovic brothers, your man Dibango, groups around Komarovsky as the kind of elderly uncle of the squad. If that group of players can stay together for a couple of years, and we said this in Bellpod after the cup final, I can see them doing really, really well. Perhaps winning a cup. They won't win the league, but they could finish in the top 6 easily and reach a cup final again. They won't in 2022. But I really wish him luck. I think he's an impressive character, and I was really gutted I couldn't come yesterday for various reasons, but I hope to come with you to the next one, and then we can both chew his ear off for an hour. So.
Indeed, I'm sure he'll be up for that as well. I mean, as I say, he went away from it talking about, giving us some updates and things like that. I just said, ultimately, as fans in the Western world, we're used to knowing everything. I said, we don't need to know what your players have for breakfast, but it would be nice to know when a player isn't playing, why they aren't playing, if there's an injury concern. He's very honest about the situation. Komarovsky said, got a problem with his knee, nothing major, but, he is a veteran player, and we just felt we had to give him a few weeks off. Well, that's the first time I've heard anyone say anything about Komarovsky. You can't find anything out there. So, that sort of thing, just the kind of openness and willingness to just, and the sense that the reason why it's not out there is because Belarusian fans in Belarus are not particularly bothered and not particularly interested. So I said, well, we are. So please let us know everything you can. Poor place. But no, it was a really great hour. It was a really good hour. And hopefully he hasn't been so scared off by our enthusiasm that he won't come back again. He certainly didn't give that impression. Moving swiftly on, we would like now, really, I suppose, we close out part one as we look back over the last 3 weeks since we last recorded. We're moving on to part two in a minute, and we'll come back with something new and interesting. I hope you'll find it so. Anyway, just after this quick break. So part two, as you know, those of you who've listened to us before, is reserved for our interview slot. And this week, having spoken at some length about the wonderful efforts of Isloch to engage with their fan community, there's really only one place we can go after that, John, isn't there? And that's to have a chat with another man who's been massively involved in the only other club for me that really engages superbly well with its fans in Belarus at the moment. And that is, of course, Krumkachy. And earlier this week, I had the pleasure of recording an interview with Dmitriy Kandarenka, who has also been heavily involved in the club in the last couple of seasons. Hey there, Dmitry. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'd really like to hear, I think, we've only been following, obviously, Belarusian football for sort of about 15 months. So we only really can relate perhaps to what's happened to Krumkachy in those last 15 months, apart from what Alex told us in an earlier episode. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about the origins of the club? And I was particularly interested about the whole kind of identity issues to do with the Belarusian language and culture.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me here. First, I'm actually giving an interview, so very glad to be here. Second of all, thank you for following the club. I think it means a lot to the club itself in terms of not only monetary value, which comes from like selling t-shirts and so on, but actually like the interest to the club from foreign viewers is pretty impressive. Because I wouldn't say Belarusian football is the most interesting, but apparently it can be. So the Orange's founding philosophy of the club was Krumkachy started as literally fans of other clubs playing together, and they had philosophy of their vision of the club, and they were just literally meeting like Sunday football league. They were just playing with each other, and then one day they decided to why not to create a club, and the philosophy of the club is that it's the people's team, so it's literally the representation of what people want to see from the club. It's complete honesty, it's openness to fans. It's Belarusian language, which is not so popular in Belarus, which is pretty sad, but it is the truth, and so on and so on. And actually, I think one of the big things which helped Krumkachy be so well known, at least in Belarus, is that they were the mix of two people. One is Alexei, the marketeer who created an amazing picture, brand image, and so on, and the ex-sport director of the club who was very good at bringing players. So he was really passionate about the club. These two people and co-owners, which one of them is still with the club, they came together and created this idea, this magical idea of actually the club created by fans can be in the first league and winning Bate Borisov, which is the all-time champion of Belarus. So that's more about the origins of the club. And Belarusian language is very important for the club. Right now, obviously, a very big part of it is also the movement of at least speaking up for the people, because most of the football clubs, as I told you, are owned by the government. So it's understandable. That's my personal view. That's not the club's view. But my personal view, it's understandable. They can't speak because they get money from the government. Here it's a bit different, which has positives and negatives in terms of, obviously, you have drawbacks of speaking up if everybody is silent. But overall, like, this creates a unique picture of the club, which right now is more and more on the people's team. And it actually is proven by all the movements the club is doing.
I think Alex talked about the sort of development, exactly what you're saying, the club for the people and that development, that ideas, and bring some really new ideas to Belarus, ideas that aren't particularly new outside Belarus, but they were quite revolutionary when he was talking about the early years of Krumkachy. You have the club built on that idea over the last sort of couple of years. Obviously there's been a lot of talk about what happened in the close season, and what do you feel it's all moved in to a slightly higher level, or is it still similar to what Alex originally envisaged?
So I would say that, first of all, I'm pretty sad that Alexei is not in the club, but he's still around the club. He's helping with the vision and with if something is needed, because he's a real fan of it. And so the same thing is done by around 14 people who are always around the club. Some of them help more, some of them help less, but all of this is for free. In terms of vision of the club, I think the biggest change right now is that previous management was very good at making players play, motivating them. Marketeer was amazing at selling the club, like selling the brand image, making what people want to see and so on. But the management, in terms of club management, was pretty weak in terms of economical benefits. Right now, the club is much more stable in terms of economics. So they have a major sponsor who is mostly paying for all the expenses. Right now, there is also a platform which gives some income, not as much as was expected, but I still believe that if you change and adjust it in some way, it can be. It's an amazing idea, but you need to make it more realistic. Yeah. So right now, I would say that in terms of the club as a football organization, it's much more stable. It's still pretty efficient in terms of how much money it spends. In terms of the unique identity, I think it was very hard in the terms of when the economical model was changing. It was very hard for the club to stick to, being people's team and so on, because there are not a lot of people working for the club. So you need to focus on one thing. It's either you're trying to save the club economically, or you're making all the amazing marks and advertising things. Like, it's one or another. It's impossible to do two. We had like a year or year and a half when it was just not the time for any like going cultural and so on. It was about trying to save the club. And then right now it's coming back to what it was coming before. with. So cultural aspects, people's team. So I think we're slowly getting back to where Krumkachy deserves to be in terms of the media image and so on.
To talk us through this time when it lost its name. What was that? Something that came about because of the economic problems, or?
Yeah, so there were two problems. But the biggest problem was economical. The sport manager, he was pretty bad at managing money. He was amazing at making players play. He was amazing at motivating people to work for the club. Very good. Amazing, by the way, speech maker. But it gets also drawbacks. For example, he was one of the few people who were speaking, telling the league what was wrong. And usually in authoritarian regimes, they don't like when somebody's telling you you're wrong, especially when they're successful and they're telling you you're wrong, especially when they have like 5 times less budget than the biggest club and they still win. All of this, together with economical problems, because there were economical problems, made the club bankrupt. There was the time when Torpedo Minsk came into the highest league. Krumkachy didn't just go down; they went out of their name. So only this season we make our Krumkachy name back. Before it was NFK, so it was some kind of the way to show to the people that the club is still what it is, but it can't use its name. So it was Krumkachy before, then became NFK. Right now, NFK Krumkachy. So it kind of gets that back and tries to show people the real name, because obviously there was a problem when literally half of the fans went out of the club and didn't support it anymore because of the fact that sport director left the club. So inside there was a big break. They went back to the third division. They went from third division to second division. Now we're in the first league. We weren't able to go last season to the highest league. I'm not going to comment on that, but hopefully we can do it this season.
So are you saying that the team we watched last season was still NFK Krumkachy? Then it was the original. It's only this season that they've gone back to their original name.
No, we're still NFK Krumkachy, but like last season it was Krumkachy already. Before it was only NFK, so you were not allowed to use Krumkachy. After the logo changed, so now we have a new logo. That's when we became NFK Krumkachy, which obviously nobody cares about NFK anymore. As long as you have Krumkachy there, fans don't care.
Right, splendid. That makes it much, much clearer. So we've talked an awful lot about what's gone on off the pitch. What do you make of this season so far on the pitch? Obviously, you're saying it's a more stable financial model, so perhaps playing costs aren't what they used to be back in the days when they were riding high in the top league. And what have you made of the season so far?
It's hard to comment because the first league this season is pretty challenging. You never know. One match you can dominate the teams you didn't dominate last seasons, and then nearly lose to Baranovichi, which used to be an outsider. Like every season, everything changes in Belarusian football. And right now, I think we have a pretty good situation in terms of the results. So we're right now top of the table. We need to be top 2. That's all we need to get promoted. Because in theory, we can even have the 3rd place and go there. But last season it was the same and it didn't work out. So this season must have prefers 2 places. It's of course surprising that it was surprising when it just happened on Oleg Dulup going out of the club. Pretty sad for me personally, but it's a club decision, so can't do anything with it. We'll see how Kazeka will manage the team and who will be the future manager. Will be Kazeka, will be another manager, I don't know. But right now it's looking good. I hope we need to have a few more players to be sure we can go through, but for now looking good.
Have you any particular players on your wish list for this transfer window? I see you brought in a striker from Gomel's reserve team who seems to have a pretty good record for them. Is there anybody else that has been talked about as being brought in to positions that need strengthening in particular, or not?
So Zgursky is in, as you said, the guy from Gomel. He used to be with us last season, so we know the guy. In this term, there is also another guy, the right back or center back, depends how you see him. The Russian guy from, I think it was Sputnik. I would say that right now the biggest problem for the club, in my view, not in the club's view, is the way they cooperate with the platform. So the platform gave the choice of the transfers because the platform is saying that you can manage the club. And they gave a choice of like 5 or 6 players with a little intro of who they are. And let's say, for example, this Russian guy, the defender, he got 2%, and then they still signed him. So there is a problem in terms of managing the expectations versus what it is in reality. But in the end, like for example, if we look at this guy, he had 2%, and then one day he got 20. So for example, I think it's one of the directors or two directors, they betted on him, so they voted for him, and that's why he got 20%. But obviously, for people, he was the last, and then apparently he gets 20%. So there are different challenges here. I think my personal view is that we need a striker, we need a finisher. We have a pretty big amount of strikers, but none of them is showing capabilities of finishing a lot. There is a guy who I would love to, from the list they showed, I think it's Ivanov as well, Dmitriy. He's right now without the contract and we can get him for free. He scored a lot of goals last season. I think that's what we need. But again, I don't see really right now the full transparency of the club with the fans on this. But again, the platform doesn't give as much money as it was projected to from the very beginning. And in this case, I'm sorry, but who is paying is choosing. If, let's say, the club needs, I'm saying random number, but let's say the club needs 500,000 or no, 300,000, and then to run a year, and then platform gives 10K. With all the respect, it's those who pay more will decide. When the platform starts giving at least like 1/3 for the full budget, we can decide it. We can discuss this. But before this, I don't think it's possible. But again, I think striker is very important. I think we needed a few more young guys. Right now, it's looking good. Hopefully, we can get one more defender onto the right back or left back who can walk the whole distance, because we're playing three center defenders. I think with these two particular spots, if we find a good striker who is a good finisher and one on the side, that's enough.
Sorted. Top two. Guaranteed.
At least we should be in the highest league. Fingers crossed.
Certainly so. Dmitry, thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting. And certainly the platform is a fascinating topic of discussion. It's certainly something that John and I will probably come back to later in the show. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you.
Dmitry, thank you for your time. It's hugely appreciated. As always, I'm always in awe of people who come on our show, as Alex did before, and speak in such good English. I'm Russian. I'm learning Russian as fast as I can, and I'm a long, long way off that level. So thank you so much for doing so. And it's just lovely to hear from somebody who's really at the cutting edge of what's going on at Krumkachy and seems enthusiastic. What I found most interesting, and it's something that we've talked about before, was the sense that maybe this portal idea is a good one, but maybe they've been too ambitious in the sense of, they haven't managed perhaps to raise as much money as they would want from it. And now people who have signed up for it still expect to have control of what's going on. And really that can't happen, can it, John? I mean, they've promised too much too early, do you not think?
Possibly, but we have to remember that the clubs in Belarus don't have the experience that fans and administrators in the UK have of fan-run clubs and so-called democratically run clubs. We saw how that fell apart and nearly killed Ebbsfleet United and National League South. I think that was at the end of the 2000s. In Scotland, there's a sort of half-hearted attempt with Caledonian Braves, but that's really not getting off the ground. And what you need is a core committed fan base on the ground. And it's fine to have, to hear the voice of the oddball investors in America or Italy or even Aberdeen and Manchester on the sidelines. But the core of the club has to be the fans that go week in, week out. And that's what you build around. And I don't think online voting systems and democratic control really work if the majority of the folk involved aren't going every week, which is what happened with Ebbsfleet. People were into it for a season, then they lost interest, stopped paying, and suddenly the business model didn't work. So I think there needs to be perhaps a wee bit of thought given there. But it's wonderful to hear from Dmitry, because I think for many people in the UK, he was one of the really influential folk that got a lot of people interested in Krumkachy, but in the wider leagues more generally, by being so generous and open with his time in running the English language commentary service on YouTube last year, which many of us still remember very fondly.
No, it's brilliant, isn't it? I suppose, I think I probably of all that he said, I could most relate, even though I'm not the money man putting all the money in. I imagine myself in the situation with the person who is funding largely, the club, and thinking, me and the coach want to sign this player, and he only got 2% of the vote on the website. What am I going to do? I think I'd be thinking, you know what? I'm paying his wages. I'm not signing the guy. So I just think that's a lovely idea. It's it's like Football Manager, isn't it? Real life Football Manager. But I just think that unless as he said, unless they're raising a large amount of the capital, and thus they are essentially he who pays the piper, etc., then I feel that probably you can't expect them to run the show, really, can you? You can't. You've got to allow the people who are putting most of the money in to have most of the control, and an online voting system doesn't allow for that. But never mind. It was really interesting to hear from him, and lots and lots of positive stuff to say about Krumkachy, and obviously we echo his wishes that Krumkachy finish in the top 2 this year, and there's no discussion to be had about whether they get promoted or not. So thank you so much for your time, Dmitry. That's the end of part 2, and we will shortly be back with a look ahead to what's coming and a bit about the transfer window in part 3. Hello again, and John, I think I'd like you now to take over as I've gabbled away for at least the last 3 minutes. I'd like you to talk about the transfer window. Go on, soothe the audience with your dulcet tones, please, and break down the transfer window for me so far.
Okay, I'm not going to do the whole transfer window, as we'll be here until our next recording in a couple of weeks' time. But I think I want to focus on one club which have really raised eyebrows this week, Liam, and that's the Bears of Smorgon, who have signed some astonishing players, you have to say, on loan. They've got Dmitry Sibilev in from Ruch. They've got Daniel Shapko in from Dinamo Minsk in goal. And this is interesting for me because it shows that coach Gerashchenko doesn't really trust any of the goalkeepers that he has in his books already. And he's brought Shapko in, and Minsk would only have loaned Shapko if he was going to play every week. So I expect we'll see his mettle. He looked good in the couple of games that Kuchuk gave him at Dinamo last season. But perhaps for me, the most eye-catching signing is Nuruddin Idris, the Nigerian striker who's been making a lot of waves with Bata's second team. And he was assessed on one of the Telegram channels as being far too good for Bata's second team, where he scored a lot of goals, but just not quite there in terms of challenging seriously for a regular place in the starting 16-18 in the Vysheshaya Liga. So he's obviously been farmed out to Smorgon for the rest of the season to go away and score some goals and prove his mettle before returning to Borisov in the winter. They've also signed Kirill Leonovich from Torpedo, and the Torpedo guys on Twitter were quite complimentary about him and thought that he would do quite well in Smorgon. So what we're seeing here, I think, is the regional executive, having bet the kitchen sink on Smorgon staying in the top league, are realising that the squad of the first half of the season won't quite do it. And they're finding every last ruble down the back of the regional executive sofas and investing them in new players who really, if Coach Gerashchenko can get them knitted together quickly, really do stand a chance, you would have thought, especially with Slavia being so poor and Sputnik dead in the water, really have a chance of maybe helping Smorgon to survive in the second part of the season. I mean, what do you think of all these signings?
I'm amazed, and also, to be fair, I'm really pleased for Smorgon, the team that's there already. Obviously, it means 4 or 5 of them are now going to lose their places, but a lad like Musa Kamara, who we've often heralded as a really excellent central midfielder at that team, they're not a million miles away, are they, John? They're not a million miles away from being. I felt that they've lacked a striker. I mean, Koval is good, but he's obviously only playing 1 in every 3 or 4 games, presumably that's for fitness reasons. They've really missed somebody who's they just don't look that likely to score, basically, doing a lot of games. Although they have scored a reasonable number of goals, but there's no one to depend on. There's no real focal point of their attack. And this signing from Bata may well provide that. And obviously, as you say, a really decent confident keeper would be another. And I like Shishevichin, don't get me wrong, but I think that certainly have shipped quite a few goals, and a decent keeper like Shakhtyor might make a big difference. So it's a statement of intent, and I love that, because I think that we thought, didn't we, probably that Smorgon and poor old RIP Sputnik would be long gone by now, and they're not. And part of that is because Neman and Slavia haven't been very good. But as we said before, although we don't like the reasons why, the fact that they're in the league, the way they got into the league, we do root for them to a certain extent, because they've been so up against it. And they've still really tried their best to keep in touch with the rest, and now they've been given a chance to survive, and I think that's got to be a good thing, and I'm glad that the executive found a few rubles down the back of his sofa. And,
well, and it makes the league more competitive as well, and it gives young players a chance in a really high pressure situation to show what they're made of. So whilst agreeing with everything you said, it was very underhand the way they came into the league, purely from the point of view of the players and the managers. This is going to be an interesting experiment in the next few weeks.
I think the other thing that struck me most of all is obviously actually something's not going to happen straight away in the transfer window. It's probably not going to happen. Presumably pre-contract agreement will kick in next season, but obviously talk that Skarvish has signed a pre-contract agreement with Shakhtyor, which is a little bit depressing in the sense that you think, well, come on, these are the top two teams in Belarus at the moment. Really, we can't really imagine, for instance, United City are local rivals in England, but you can't really imagine, let's say, Liverpool, who are chasing City, selling their best player or one of the best players,
or Marcus Rashford moving to Chelsea or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not going to happen, is it? So, and obviously, we are talking about money talking here. Skarvish, not at the end of his career, but getting towards the end of his career. He probably wants one last big contract, which Shakhtar are able to offer him. And then obviously for me, one of the sort of sad offshoots of that, although we don't know it's definitely going to happen, is of course now Barty thinking, well, let's go and get Solovey from Gomel. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but to me, that would be a great shame, because I've so enjoyed watching Gomel this season, and he's been a massive part of that Solovey. Do you see that happening?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, the Skarvish thing is definitely happening, because Vlad Tatur announced that, and it was confirmed by others. So he's a thoroughly reliable source who doesn't publish things unless they're pretty watertight. So Skarvish will be at Shakhtyor next season. Look, it's a short career. Shakhtyor will be able to pay him much more than Bata, who are able to. I think also there'll be perhaps a little bit of a sweetener involved, and Bata need all the money that they can get at the moment. Clearly, they're preparing a big bid for Andrei Solovey. The fly in the ointment for Bata is that Solovey is a very loyal boy, and he could have left Lokomotiv a couple of seasons ago for much bigger money, perhaps for a top-flight club, and he didn't go. Now, partly that was because of his army service, but also I think partly he was happy at Lokomotiv. He was the king of the Pershaya Liga in terms of goals. He was enjoying his football. So it depends how well he's getting on with Coach Bionchik. And Gomel aren't like half the league desperate for money and will sell to whoever offers a reasonable fee. Gomel have money, and they don't need a huge sum of money yet. So I would suspect that any move won't happen till the winter transfer window. But given the nature of Solovey and his loyalty to clubs where he's happy, I wouldn't see this move as guaranteed. It makes sense on paper, but then, of course, transfers aren't purely done on paper. They're done on how a transfer target gets on with his new coach, what the atmosphere is like in Borisov, whether he feels that Gomel can perhaps challenge Bata and be second themselves in a season or so, or whether he sees himself going to Bata and trying to get them back in top. It's a myriad range of factors, so I think this one will run for a while yet.
Indeed. So looking ahead to this weekend, it's been a weekend off again, hasn't it? I just can't cope with this. We've had a couple of weekends off recently, international duties and everything, it's not good for us, John, is it? Never mind this year nonsense. I'm quite sure you didn't even watch the game last weekend anyway. But thankfully, I've got some excellent football for you for this weekend. And there's one match, of course, that stands out above all else, I think, isn't there?
And what's that, in your opinion?
It's Rook against Gomel, of course, John.
It is. And that was a wonderful, that was when Gomel really announced themselves at the beginning of the season, wasn't it? Because I remember thinking the predictor, Gomel are going to go and get absolutely drubbed down there and just shrug and put it down to experience. But they were very unlucky not to win that game. That said, I think it'll be a slightly different game this time, simply because Ruch won't be as complacent as perhaps they were in the first game and will be much more aware of how Gom will play. And surely Kirill Olszewski's got to come up with a tactical plan that will help his team down there. And you also have to say that Ruch have really come onto a game in the last few weeks, and they've had some good results. They look much more cohesive. Olszewski has been given the time, as we hoped he would, to try and get the side looking a bit more like a team that didn't meet at the bus stop 5 minutes before kick-off. And that's working now. So you're quite right. I mean, that's a really intriguing game, and one that I'm really, really looking forward to.
There's not a huge amount else out there. It's just obviously we've got one fewer game this week. Dinamo Brest will be kicking their heels, unfortunately. In fact, we've got 2 fewer games, haven't we? Because we've not got FC Minsk or Shakhtyor. I can't really understand that, really. I mean, I understand being given time off before the games, possibly. In the Shakhtyor, an enormous squad. I'm not really sure they need 2 games off. But that's why I was slightly confused about having the week off last weekend, because, John, I was like, I couldn't believe they'd be giving the game off after they played. I mean, I know they've had to presumably have a quite tortuous journey back from Belgrade, but they played on Tuesday. Could they not have played on Sunday? I mean, I find it quite bizarre.
Look, this is a nonsense for me, and I agree with you. You've got Celtic, Manchester City playing 4 days after big Champions League games. Sure, of course, the managers complain like hell about fixture congestion, but they do play. They get on with it, and I can't understand this kid glove treatment of Shakhtyor. Really, their seconds could probably win a game with Minsk at the moment. They're such a powerful squad, so why don't we just get on with it and not inconvenience other teams, you know? Just thinking a little bit further on, of course, this is the reverse of the opening day fixtures. At the bottom of the table, Smorgon against Energetic is quite a big game for me, and a lot of these new signings that we've just been mentioning will be on display. And I would also look with some interest at Dinamo Minsk's return to Torpedo. And you do wonder if a sad Leonid Kuchuk will be watching that somewhere, because you remember the opening game of the season and Dinamo looked tremendous. Torpedo, it just hasn't happened for them this season, has it? The Brazilian signings haven't worked out. The teams look disjointed. Yuri's desperately rifled through the combinations and formations without really settling on one that looks convincing. Poor Khachaturian's done his anterior cruciate. And to rub salt into the wound, Gabi Ramos and Lipe Veloso aren't getting a look in at Riga. They're not near the first team. So that, for me, will be a really interesting game. I don't think it will be as high intensity as it was in the first game of the season. How do you see that one turning out? It's quite hard to predict, isn't it?
It is indeed, because we've talked about Dinamo being on a bit of a run at the moment. They seem more confident. They seem more settled as a side, certainly. But I just always think Torpedo have got a good 90 minutes in them. You know, they really are a decent side. I know Antilevsky. I'm not sure what's happened with Antilevsky. Has he actually gone to Russia and not come back? I know he was trialling in Russia, wasn't he, the elder brother? I just don't know where his situation is. He's not key to their success anyway, I would say, although he is a big player for them. But yeah, they just always feel to me like they've got a big game in them, but they've never quite managed to put it together, and it might be this weekend.
Well, it will be interesting, and I think Yuri will have revenge in mind there, because that was a major humiliation for him and his team in the first game of the season. So I think I'll be keeping an interested eye on that one. Isloch and Artem Radkov are down at Slavia, Liam, and Slavia, for me, I can't understand why. I keep saying this on a stuck record every episode. Why on earth are they persisting with Martinovic? Is he someone's son-in-law? Is he married to the chairman's daughter? You know, what is going on there? They really, when you consider that you have Kuchuks, you have 3 or 4 other really decent Belarusian coaches, Alexei Baga, for example, the boy Molosh who left Liepaja in Latvia. These are decent coaches who could really do something there, but for some reason Slavia seem frozen in the headlights, don't they? And you'd fancy Isloch to go down there and get a good result.
I think you're probably right with that, but we'll see in due course. It's going to be a pleasure as always to see what happens. I'm probably not going to get to see as many games in their entirety this weekend, but I look forward to the ABFF providing me with copious amounts of highlights, and I'm sure I'll catch the odd live game or two. Pleasure as always to have the chance to share our thoughts with you. Thank you so much for keeping with us and continue to support us through this entire 6 months. So we'll hear from you again soon, hopefully, and you'll certainly hear from us in due course.
Great. Thanks for listening, everyone, and see you next time.